It's time for another installment of This Week in History. So this is where we do 4 stories, local, national, world, and some pop culture. Kind of give you an idea of what was going on everywhere this week in the years gone by. So, without further ado, let's jump into it. Locally, this week in history, 86 years ago, on December 3rd, 1934, the former head of Mass General Hospital, Dr. George Hoyt Bigelow, went missing after leaving his home in Milton, Massachusetts. Bigelow had been the head of Mass General from 1925 to 1933, so he had only recently left that post. So he was missing after leaving his home in Milton, and then on the next day, December 4th, he no-showed 2 speeches he was supposed to make in New York City. It was at this point that a nationwide search was performed. People covered all 48 of the lower states looking for Dr. Bigelow with no success. He was seen as a distinguished citizen who brought honor to the community. A lot of people wanted to pitch in and try to find him. About 3 weeks after his disappearance, a body was found in a canal that fit his physical description, but after doing some tests, they found out it was not his body. In March, a man named Robert Fleck, who lived in the Sudbury Reservoir area of Framingham, thought he spotted a man that looked like George Bigelow, but he did not report it. And sadly, on March 24th, 1935, Bigelow's body was found in the Sudbury Reservoir in Framingham. It was ruled a suicide, as there was a note to his wife and his teenage daughter and son found on his person, and his briefcase was found nearby in pristine condition. It was a sad end to Dr. Bigelow, although to this day, despite it being ruled a suicide and he left a note, there's still so many questions and so much uncertainty around what happened to him and what caused him to end his own life. This week in history, 87 years ago, December 5th, 1933, the 18th Amendment was overturned, ending Prohibition. Prohibition was enacted on January 17th, 1920, after being ratified about a year earlier. Prohibition was kind of coming down the pike anyway, as around the turn of the 20th century, there were already temperance societies, as alcohol was seen as a evil entity. Then World War I broke out, and there was already a temporary prohibition by President Woodrow Wilson. They wanted to save the grain that was going to make alcohol to make food. And Prohibition was a relative success at first, but then it led to people making their own alcohol, bathtub gin, moonshine. It also led to the rise of the mafia with bootlegging, rum running, bringing illegal alcohol in, and bringing it to places they called speakeasies. These were other sorts of stores and shops that were fronts for actual bars. It's not quite like the things you'd see in the movies where you'd hit a button and the wall would flip around. But it was kind of that area, and they would get raided quite often, and the alcohol would be destroyed. The repeal came about partially because Prohibition wasn't really working that well. Obviously, if there's crime and people are making their own alcohol and stills are blowing up from it, it's not doing its job. Also, though, in the early 30s, the Great Depression was taking hold, so it was kind of seen as a way to stimulate the economy by bringing alcohol back. On December 5th, 1933, Prohibition was repealed. So the first drink occurred in New York City. A man named Benjamin de Caceres, who was a journalist, he had a Scotch highball. It occurred 2.5 seconds after repeal struck at midnight. So he was obviously waiting with his drink to just slam it down. Ironically, the person with the second fastest time having a drink after Prohibition happened in Chicago, and it was a man named Oscar Mayer, who everybody knows created the skinless hot dog. His drink happened 4 seconds after repeal, and he said the reason that de Caceres had his first is because he didn't drink his like a gentleman would. And even though Prohibition ended, a lot of states and towns stayed dry for years later. In fact, on Cape Cod, the town of Eastham stayed dry until the 1960s. So even though Prohibition ended, it didn't take hold everywhere for years and years to come. This week in history, as we go worldwide, 216 years ago, on December 2nd, 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself the first emperor of France at the age of 34. In the years before that, he had been a successful French general and actually overthrew the government in a bloodless coup in 1799. His goal was military expansion of France, though when his time was up as emperor, it was only slightly larger than it was before he had been there. Before he became emperor for life, he was actually elected consul for life in 1802. He enacted the Napoleonic Code. This granted all men in France equal rights, not so much for women, and it reintroduced slavery. So it was not exactly a great thing, but he is well known for it. Napoleon is also known for supposedly his height. He was supposedly short, although in reality he was 5'7", which was actually slightly taller than average back then. So there's a rumor that it was kind of British propaganda saying that he was really short. After becoming emperor, Napoleon staged an invasion of Russia in 1812. That failed, and a lot of his men were killed. So Napoleon was banished to the island of Elba in 1814, which is off the west coast of Italy. Within a year, he had regained the throne from Louis XVIII. Then he had his Battle of Waterloo in Belgium in 1815. He was defeated soundly there, which led to him abdicating his throne and being exiled again, this time to the island of St. Helena, 1,150 miles west of Angola on the continent of Africa, and more than 4,000 miles from France. That's where he spent the remaining years of his life before he died in 1821 of stomach cancer at the age of 51. And finally, this week in history, 38 years ago, this week, November 30th, 1982, 24-year-old Michael Jackson released his album Thriller. It would go on to become one of the highest-selling albums in the history of music. Michael Jackson was not exactly unknown at the time, as he had been with the Jackson 5 since the mid-1960s, and he wasn't even that unknown as a solo artist, as he had released his album Off the Wall that had been a big hit in 1979. As big as the album would get, it actually started off slowly, debuting at number 11. The first single was the song The Girl Is Mine he did with Paul McCartney, and it wasn't that. I mean, it was a hit, but it wasn't seen as something that was going to change the world like this album ended up really doing. When it hit its peak, though, Thriller was selling 1 million copies a week. It ended up 37 weeks at number 1, 7 top 10 hits, and they read like a who's who of great songs in the history of R&B with Billie Jean, Beat It, Thriller. The Thriller video, oh my God. Used to be able to see, they had the whole thing on MTV with the making of it, and that was a big thing to watch. His videos, Michael Jackson back then, it was something that you had never seen before. I remember, I think my family and I think we actually rented the making of Thriller videotape. I think that, imagine that, spending money at a video store to watch a video about making a video. But that's how big Thriller was. Michael Jackson ended up becoming at least one of the most recognizable faces on the planet after that album. The total sales, it's officially 33 million copies in the US, although these numbers range anywhere from 33. I've heard upwards of the mid 40s. I've heard worldwide it's 100 million. All I know is it was a huge, huge album. I actually got the album for Christmas of that year, and I would take my Fisher-Price record player, stick it in the window, and play the album. And the first song, Wanna Be Startin' Something, you start with that, and kids in the neighborhood would come and dance around in the front yard. That's my memory of this album. Playing it all the time, and it was huge. So that was This Week in History. Hopefully you enjoyed these. I would say for most of you, the Michael Jackson one would probably bring back memories. I don't think any of these other ones would. I'll come back next time with some more interesting stuff about This Week in History, local, national, worldwide, and pop culture.